1 in 4 men who worked as high climbers died doing the job. Not over a lifetime in the occupation, but among those who did it long enough, the death rate approached 25%. The job was simple to describe and impossible to comprehend until you stood at the base of a 200-foot tree and understood that your task was to climb it using only steel spikes strapped to your boots and a rope around your waist. Ascend to a height where the tree was still 12 to 24 inches thick. Cut off everything above that point while you were standing on it, and then ride the whip when the top fell and the entire tree oscillated violently for 30 seconds, swinging you through arcs of 10 to 20 feet. And if you survived that, descend and do it again the next day. High climbers were the men who topped spar trees for high-lead logging operations in the Pacific Northwest from the 1910s through the 1960s. They were specialists, elite workers who commanded the highest wages in the logging camps and the most respect. They were also, statistically, the most likely to die. A 200-foot fall is unsurvivable. The impact velocity is over 70 miles per hour. The human body, hitting the ground from that height, is destroyed. There are no exceptions, no miracle survivals, no close calls. If you fell, you died. And the physics didn't care how skilled you were or how many times you'd done it before. This is the story of the high climbers, the men who had the most dangerous job in America, who they were, how they did it, what killed them, and why anyone would volunteer for work that had a 1 in 4 chance of ending in a fall that would leave you unrecognizable. Let's start with why the job existed, because high climbers weren't just showing off or taking unnecessary risks. They were essential to an industrial process that had no alternative. High-lead logging, which dominated the Pacific Northwest timber industry from the 1910s onward, used tall trees as towers to lift logs clear of the ground. The system required a spar tree, a tree that was topped, stripped of branches, and rigged with cables and blocks. The spar had to be tall, 150 to 250 feet, and it had to be strong enough to support the immense loads of the logging operation, tensions of 20 to 50 tons. But the tree, as it stood in the forest, had a top. The upper section, the crown, was too thin and too flexible to support rigging. It had to be removed, cut off, leaving a stable pole. And the only way to remove it was to have someone climb the tree, ascend to the point where the trunk was the right diameter, and cut it off. There was no alternative. Cranes didn't exist in a form that could reach that height in the forest. You couldn't rig from the ground and pull the top off, because the forces involved would damage the spar. Someone had to climb, and that someone was the high climber. Who were these men? They were young, almost universally. The job required agility, strength, and a certain disregard for mortality that fades with age and experience. Most high climbers were in their 20s or early 30s. A man in his 40s could still do the work if he was fit, but the physical demands were such that older men couldn't compete. The backgrounds varied. Some were loggers who transitioned into climbing, who had worked as fallers or rigging crew and wanted the higher pay and the status. Some were drifters, men who moved from camp to camp, who had no ties and no long-term plans. Some were athletes, men who had climbed trees or poles or structures for sport or work, and found that the logging camps would pay them to do what they already knew how to do. And some were desperate, men who needed money and were willing to take a job that others refused. The personality type was consistent. High climbers were adrenaline seekers, fatalists, or both. You had to be comfortable with risk, not in an abstract sense, but in the immediate, visceral sense of standing on spikes 200 feet in the air, with nothing below you but death. Some men thrived on it, on the fear and the mastery of the fear. Others were fatalistic, accepting that death was a possibility and deciding that if it happened, it would be quick, which was better than a slow death from disease or poverty. And they were proud. Being a high climber meant something in the camps. It was a mark of distinction, a job that not everyone could do, and the men who did it were known by name, respected, and watched with a mixture of admiration and dread. Recruitment was informal. The job wasn't advertised. If a logging operation needed a high climber, word would go out and someone would show up, someone who claimed they could do it. Sometimes there was a test, a shorter tree to prove competence. Often the test was the job itself. You climbed or you didn't. If you succeeded, you were hired. If you fell, you were buried and they'd find someone else. Training was minimal. You learned by watching someone else do it, and then you did it yourself. There were techniques, tricks that experience taught, but the core of the job was simple. Climb, cut, don't fall. Everything else was detail. The turnover was high. Men died, or they retired after a few close calls, or they aged out, their bodies unable to handle the demands. A career of 5 to 10 years was typical. A career of 20 years was rare and legendary, and the men who achieved it were spoken of with awe. The equipment was so minimal that it's almost shocking. The entire kit that a high climber used could fit in a small bag, and it consisted of tools that had barely evolved since the job was invented. Climbing spurs, also called gaffs or spikes, were steel spikes 3 to 4 inches long, attached to a steel frame that was strapped to the climber's boots with leather straps. The spikes were sharpened to a point, designed to penetrate bark and dig into the wood beneath. When the climber stepped, he drove the spike into the tree, and his weight held it in place. The spikes took the climber's full weight, hundreds of pounds concentrated on a point the size of a nail, and they had to hold, every time, for hours. If a spike slipped, if the bark was rotten, or if the wood was too hard, or if the angle was wrong, the spike would pull out, and the climber would fall. The climbing rope, sometimes called a safety belt, though the term is misleading, was a loop of manila rope or wire rope, 15 to 20 feet long, that went around the tree and around the climber's waist or chest. The rope allowed the climber to lean back, taking some of the weight off his arms, and it provided a connection to the tree if the spike slipped. But it wasn't a safety device in the modern sense. If both spikes failed simultaneously, the rope might catch the climber, or it might not. The rope could fray, it could slip, it could break under the sudden shock load. It was better than nothing, but it wasn't reliable. The tools were a saw, either a crosscut saw in the early days or a chainsaw later, and an axe. The saw was used for the back cut, cutting through the trunk. The axe was used for the undercut, the notch that controlled the direction of the fall. Both tools were carried on the climber's belt while he climbed, adding 20 to 40 pounds to his load. There were also ropes for rigging, for lowering tools or for pulling up blocks once the spar was topped, but those were secondary. The core equipment was spurs, rope, saw, and axe. That was it. No helmet, no harness with redundant lines, no backup systems. The climber's safety depended entirely on his skill and his equipment holding, and the equipment was simple to the point of crudeness. The climb itself was a test of endurance and technique that most people cannot imagine, and that even describing doesn't fully convey. Let me try. You approach the tree. It's been selected by the rigging engineer, marked and limbed, all the branches removed, so the trunk is a bare pole from the ground to the top. It's a Douglas fir, 6 feet in diameter at the base, tapering to perhaps 2 feet at 150 feet, and the top is somewhere above 200. Your job is to climb to the point where the trunk is about 18 inches in diameter, cut it off, and rig the blocks. You strap on your spurs, adjust the rope around the tree and around your waist, and you begin. You stab the right spur into the bark, low, maybe 3 feet off the ground. You stab the left spur higher, maybe a foot higher. You flip the rope up, raising the loop around the tree a foot or two. You lean back against the rope, and you step up, driving the spurs deeper. The motion is stab, flip, step. Stab, flip, step. A rhythm that you have to maintain for the next 30 to 60 minutes. The first 20 feet are the hardest because your body isn't warmed up and the rhythm isn't established. Your arms are already burning from flipping the rope, which weighs several pounds and has to be lifted and repositioned with every step. Your legs are flexing constantly, driving the spurs, holding your position. Your core is engaged, balancing, keeping you upright against the tree. At 50 feet, you're above the canopy of the surrounding smaller trees. The air is clearer, the view is opening, but you don't look down. Looking down is a mistake. It breaks your focus and it introduces fear, and fear will paralyze you. You look at the tree, at the bark in front of your face, at the next spike point, and you climb. At 100 feet, the tree begins to sway. Not much, just a gentle movement in the wind, but it's noticeable. The tree is flexible, and at this height, the wind has more leverage. You feel it through your body, a slow, smooth oscillation, and you adjust your rhythm to match it, climbing during the still moments, waiting out the sways. At 150 feet, the sway is more pronounced, 2 or 3 feet in each direction, and the wind is constant. You're above everything now. The surrounding forest is below you. The view, if you allowed yourself to look, would be spectacular. Miles of forest and mountains. But you don't look. You climb. Your arms are beyond burning. They're numb, exhausted, and you're relying on muscle memory and stubbornness to keep moving. Your breath is labored. The exertion and the altitude, not high enough to thin the air significantly, but enough to notice, are wearing you down. At 180 feet, you're approaching the topping point. You stop, hang on your rope, and you inspect the tree. You're looking for the right diameter, 18 to 24 inches. And you're looking for defects, cracks in the bark, discoloration, anything that might indicate rot or weakness. You tap the tree with the back of your axe, listening to the sound. A solid, resonant thud means healthy wood. A dull, hollow sound means trouble. You make your decision. This is the spot. You position yourself, drive your spurs deep, and you begin the topping process. The undercut comes first. You pull your axe from your belt and you start chopping. You're cutting a wedge-shaped notch into the side of the tree, facing the direction you want the top to fall. The notch has to be deep, a third of the diameter, and it has to be angled correctly. Every swing of the axe is a test of balance. You're standing on spikes, leaning against a rope, 180 feet in the air, and you're swinging a 4-pound axe with enough force to bite deep into the wood. The tree is swaying, and you're swaying with it. The axe work takes 10, 15, 20 minutes. Your arms are screaming, but you keep swinging because the notch has to be right. When the undercut is complete, you switch to the saw. You position the saw on the opposite side of the tree, and you start cutting toward the notch. This is the back cut, and it's the most dangerous part of the job. As you cut, you're removing the wood that's holding the top upright. The top, everything above your cut, weighs several tons. It's under stress, compressed by its own weight, and as you cut, you're releasing that stress. You have to leave a hinge, a section of uncut wood between the back cut and the notch. That will control the fall. Too much hinge and the top won't fall. Too little and it falls unpredictably. You saw and you listen. You're listening for the crack, the sound that tells you the top is starting to move. And then you hear it. A sharp, resonant crack. Like a gunshot, but deeper. The top is going. You pull the saw out, drop it on the rope attached to your belt, and you brace. The top leans, slowly at first, then faster. It separates from the trunk with a tearing sound, and it falls, crashing down through the canopy below. 100 feet of tree, tons of wood, gone. And then the whip. The moment the top separates, the spar, suddenly freed of the weight it was supporting, rebounds. The entire trunk, 180 feet of it, whips like a fishing rod. You're standing at the top and you're thrown. The spar bends, oscillates, swings you in arcs of 10, 15, 20 feet. You're holding on, spurs dug in as deep as they'll go, rope tight, hands gripping the trunk, and you're being whipped back and forth, your body flung through the air, the G-forces pulling at you, trying to tear you loose. The whip lasts 30 seconds, sometimes a minute, the oscillations gradually dampening, and you hold on. There's nothing else you can do. You hold on, and you wait for it to stop, and you hope that your spurs don't rip out, that your rope doesn't break, that the spar doesn't snap under the stress. And when it stops, when the spar finally settles, you're still there, still alive, and you can breathe again. You've topped the spar. Now you have to descend 180 feet with arms that are jelly and legs that are shaking, and you have to do it without falling, because falling now, after surviving the top and the whip, would be a pointless death. And then, the next day, or the next week, you do it again. What killed high climbers was varied, but the result was almost always the same: a fall from height and death on impact. The causes were different, but the outcome was physics. Falls during the climb were common. A spur would slip, pulling out of the bark. This happened when the bark was rotten, when the wood beneath was too hard for the spike to penetrate, or when the climber's angle was wrong. If one spur slipped and the climber couldn't catch himself with the other spur or the rope, he fell. The descent was 1 to 2 seconds from 200 feet. The impact velocity was 70 to 80 miles per hour, depending on the height. The human body, hitting the ground at that speed, experiences forces of 50 to 100 Gs. Every bone breaks. Internal organs rupture. Death is instantaneous. There are no survivable falls from that height. The body is often unrecognizable, the trauma so severe that identification is difficult. In 1927, in an operation near Eugene, Oregon, a climber named Jack Peterson fell from 180 feet. Witnesses on the ground said they saw him slip, saw one spur come out, saw him grab for the rope, and then he was falling. He hit the ground on his back, and the impact drove his spine through his chest cavity. He was 24 years old. He'd been a high climber for 3 years. Falls during the whip were equally lethal and more dramatic. The whip, the violent oscillation of the spar when the top fell, generated forces that could exceed the climber's ability to hold on. The spar would swing, and the climber would be flung outward, and if his grip failed, if his spurs pulled out, if the rope snapped, he was thrown clear of the tree, sometimes 50 or more feet from the base, and he fell from whatever height he'd been at when he lost his grip. In 1931, in Washington State, a climber named Tom Harlan had topped spars successfully over 20 times. He was experienced, careful, respected. On his 21st spar, the whip was more violent than usual. Witnesses said the spar bent so far that Harlan was nearly horizontal at the peak of the oscillation. He held on through the first few swings, but on the fourth or fifth, his spurs ripped out. He was thrown clear, fell from 160 feet, and landed 40 feet from the base of the spar. He was 31 years old. His career had lasted 8 years, and he'd beaten the odds until he didn't. Spar failures were less common, but catastrophic. A spar tree, supporting the loads of high-lead logging, was operating at the edge of its structural capacity. If the tree had a rotten core, a condition that wasn't always detectable from the outside, the spar could break. The break could happen during the whip, when the stress was highest, or it could happen later, during the rigging or the first pulls. If the spar broke while the climber was on it, the climber rode it down. There was no escape. The spar would snap, and the upper section, with the climber attached, would fall. In 1929, in Northern California, a climber named Bill Sorensen topped a redwood spar. The cut was clean, the whip was normal, and Sorensen survived and began descending to rig the blocks. At about 100 feet, the spar snapped. The break occurred at a rotten section that hadn't been visible. The upper 150 feet of the spar, with Sorensen on it, fell. Sorensen and the spar hit the ground together. He was crushed under the weight of the tree. He was 26. Widowmakers, dead branches caught in the canopy, killed climbers in a different way. When a climber was working, especially during the topping, the vibrations and the impacts would sometimes dislodge branches that had been hung up in the canopy above. These branches, some of them large, would fall without warning, striking the climber. A branch hitting a climber in the head or shoulders could kill him outright or knock him unconscious, and an unconscious climber fell. There were other causes, rarer but documented. Saw accidents, a climber cutting himself while working on the spurs, bleeding out before he could descend. Lightning, climbers caught on spars during storms, the spar acting as a lightning rod. Heart attacks, the exertion and the fear combining to stop a heart. Each of these was rare, but they happened, and they added to the toll. But most high climbers who died fell, and the fall was the result of a spur slip, a whip, or a spar failure. The death rate, estimated from camp records and oral histories, was between 15 and 25% for men who worked as high climbers for more than a few years. 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 didn't survive. Compare that to any other occupation. Coal mining, often cited as extremely dangerous, had a death rate of about 1 in 1,000 per year in the same era. Commercial fishing, another deadly job, was similar. High climbing was an order of magnitude more dangerous, and everyone involved knew it. The survivors, the men who climbed for years and lived to retire, were a minority, and they carried scars, physical and psychological, for the rest of their lives. Physically, even climbers who never fell were injured. The whip could slam a climber against the spar, breaking ribs, dislocating shoulders. Falls from lower heights, 20 or 30 feet, were sometimes survivable, but left men crippled. Cuts from saws and axes were common. And the hearing loss, from the chainsaws and the noise of the falling tops, was universal among climbers who worked into the chainsaw era. Psychologically, the survivors carried the weight of the close calls, the friends lost, the knowledge that they'd been lucky. Interviews with surviving high climbers, recorded in the 1950s through the 1980s as the last of them aged, reveal common themes. The fear was always there. It didn't go away with experience. It was managed, controlled, pushed aside, but it was present every time they climbed. They acknowledged luck. Skill mattered, but luck mattered more. You could be the best climber in the world, and if the spar had a hidden rot, you died. And they expressed pride. They had done something extraordinary, something that most people couldn't even imagine, and they had survived. One survivor, interviewed in the 1970s, a man named Harold High Pocket Hansen, who had climbed for over 30 years, said, "Every time I came down, I thought, well, I beat it again. And every time I went up, I wondered if this was the one. But I kept going up because that's what I did. That's who I was." Hansen retired in 1955, one of the last of the era, and he died in 1982, in bed, at the age of 76, having beaten the odds for 3 decades. Why did men do this job, knowing the risks, knowing the death rate, knowing that the odds were against them? The answer is layered. Economics was the most obvious factor. High climbers were the highest paid workers in the logging camps. In the 1920s through the 1940s, a high climber could make $10 to $20 a day, sometimes more for particularly difficult or dangerous climbs. Compare that to $3 for a laborer, $5 for a faller. It was serious money. Over a season, a high climber could make $2,000 to $3,000, equivalent to $60,000 to $90,000 today. For men supporting families, especially immigrant men sending money home, that kind of income was transformative. It could buy land, could bring a family over, could change a life. But the money alone doesn't explain it. The alternatives were limited. Other logging jobs were dangerous too, just not as dangerous, and they paid less. Non-logging work, farm labor, factory work, paid even less. During the Depression, any job was precious, and a high-paying job, even a deadly one, was worth taking. For immigrant men, for men with limited English, for men with no formal education, the opportunities were even more restricted. High climbing didn't require reading or writing or speaking English fluently. It required courage and skill, and those were qualities that many men had. Status mattered. In the logging camps, high climbers were at the top of the social hierarchy. They were respected, feared, admired. Their names were known. Stories were told about their climbs, their close calls, their legendary feats. For men who had little else, who owned nothing, who had no formal achievements, being a high climber was an identity. It was something. And there was the adrenaline, the thrill, the mastery of fear. Some men were drawn to the job for that reason. They wanted the challenge, the test, the proof that they could do something that others couldn't. The fear was part of the appeal, and conquering it, day after day, was its own reward. The end of the high climber era came with the introduction of steel spar towers in the 1940s and 50s. Steel towers were portable, could be erected and moved, and they didn't require topping. They were safer, more predictable, and over time, more economical. The logging companies adopted them, and the need for high climbers disappeared. By the 1960s, high climbing was rare, limited to a few old operations that still used tree spars. By the 1970s, it was essentially gone. The last generation of high climbers, men born in the 1920s and 30s, retired or died, and there were no successors. The job was obsolete. The skill, the knowledge of how to read a tree, how to judge the cut, how to ride the whip, was lost. There were no training programs because there had never been formal training. It was always mentor and apprentice, watching and doing. And when there was no longer a need, the knowledge died with the last practitioners. Today, there are occasional historical demonstrations, carefully controlled events where climbers, using modern safety equipment, top a spar to show what it was like. But it's not the same. The danger is mitigated. The stakes are removed. The real job, the one where you climbed with nothing but spurs and a rope and the knowledge that a mistake meant death, that job is gone. What remains is the photographic record, stunning black and white images of men on spars, tiny figures against the sky, the tops falling, the whips captured mid-oscillation. The images are dramatic, almost unbelievable, and they're some of the most iconic representations of the logging era. Photographers like Darius Kinsey documented the high climbers, and those images are now in museums, in archives, in books about logging history. There are oral histories, audio recordings of the last survivors, their voices describing the climbs, the fear, the losses. These recordings are in library archives, historical societies, accessible to researchers but largely unknown to the public. And there are the memories, fading now, held by the descendants of the high climbers, the sons and daughters and grandchildren who heard the stories, who saw the scars, who buried the men who fell or who lived. The high climbers had the most dangerous job in America. The death rate was higher than any other occupation, higher than coal mining, higher than commercial fishing, higher than any military occupation in peacetime. They knew it. They did it anyway. For money, for status, for the challenge, for the lack of alternatives. They climbed 200-foot trees with equipment that was barely adequate. They cut off the tops while standing on them. They rode the whips that could throw them to their deaths, and they descended and did it again. 1 in 4 didn't survive. The others lived with the knowledge that they'd been lucky, that the next climb could be the one, and they climbed anyway. So here's to the high climbers, the men who topped the spars, who made high-lead logging possible, who commanded the highest wages and the most respect, and who paid for it with a death rate that no modern worker would accept. Here's to Jack Peterson and Tom Harlan, and Bill Sorensen, and the hundreds of others whose names are lost, who fell from heights that guaranteed death, who hit the ground at 70 miles per hour and were buried in small-town cemeteries with simple stones. Here's to Harold Hansen and the others who survived, who climbed for decades, who beat the odds and lived to tell the stories. And here's to the skill, the knowledge, the trade that no longer exists, that died with the last practitioners, that we can only understand through photographs and recordings and the fading memories of a generation that's almost gone. They had the most dangerous job in America, and they did it with spurs and a rope and nothing else. The most dangerous job, and they knew it, and they climbed anyway.